In October of 2012, a produce buyer from Chicago drove down to a farmer's market in Decatur, Illinois, cut a beet in half, held the two pieces up to the gray autumn light, and went very quiet for a long time. She was not a sentimental woman. She had spent 19 years sourcing specialty produce across 5 regional markets, and she had developed a particular economy of expression that comes from evaluating hundreds of products a year. She did not use any of the words a buyer reaches for when something surprises her. She asked one question, then she asked another. And 3 weeks later, a written contract arrived at a farmhouse on County Road 1000 East in Shelby County for $186,000. In 2009, a county extension agent from the University of Illinois Cooperative Extension Service had stood in that same farmhouse's front field, pushed a soil probe into the ground, and told the woman who owned it that she was fighting the soil, that nobody grew root crops in glacial clay without amendment, that she would stunt every taproot she planted. 3 years separated those two moments. What happened between them is the story of 22 acres of ground that the credentialed world had written off, and of the woman who understood it in a way that took a lifetime to learn. If you have ever known someone who stayed with a thing past the point where the conventional wisdom said to quit, past the point where the numbers made sense to anyone but them, you may already know how the story goes. If you haven't, stay with it. The arithmetic at the end is worth the time. Which brings us back to the beginning, and to Ruth Holek, and to the clay. Ruth Holek was 57 years old in 2009, and she was known in Shelby County for 2 things. One was a quietness that people sometimes mistook for stubbornness. The other was a knowledge of root vegetables that she had never once tried to explain to anyone who hadn't asked. She had dark eyes and brown-gray hair she kept pinned back under a canvas work hat, and her hands were the hands of a person who had worked the same ground for 40 years. She ran 22 acres on the east side of the county, 12 of them row-cropped in corn and soybeans under a cash lease that paid the taxes, and 14 of them in what the County Farm Bureau politely called the problematic clay plots. Those 14 acres ran along a low glacial ridge where the topsoil was thin, and the subsoil was a dense gray-blue clay, heavy and poorly drained, the kind of soil that cracked open in July like old leather and swelled back into itself in April. It was, by every conventional measure, wrong for root crops. It was the soil her mother had planted in 1971. Vera Holek had come to Shelby County from Moravia in the spring of that year, a widow with 2 suitcases and a canvas notebook tucked under one arm. The notebook was not a journal. It was a working document, dense with small penciled entries in 2 languages. The Czech names of beet varieties ran down the left side of each page, their translated names and germination notes on the right, and along the outer margins she had written her own observations about the soil on the property she had bought. For almost nothing precisely because no neighboring farmer wanted it. Vera had grown up on clay. She understood clay in a way that no extension service had ever formalized into a bulletin, because what she understood about it had been learned row by row, season by season, across a generation before hers in a country where you did not amend soil you could not afford to amend. You learned what it would grow. What it would grow, Vera discovered, was beets. Not the uniform commercial beets of the hybrid catalogs, but the older kinds. The Chioggia, with its red and white concentric rings like a cross-section of a planet. The Cylindra, with its long, dark carrot-like body that penetrated clay more easily than any round variety. The golden Detroit that blushed amber inside and concentrated its sugars slowly under stress. Vera planted them in the clay without tilling, using a narrow iron dibber to open holes just wide enough for a seed, setting each one 8 inches apart, laying a thin line of finished compost along the surface where the seed would germinate. She did not break the clay. She planted into it. Ruth was 14 years old when she began keeping notes alongside her mother's, filling the back pages of Vera's notebook with her own observations in English. She noted germination rates by row and by year, the correlation between a dry July and a higher Brix reading in the Chioggia, the specific pocket on the north end of the ridge where the clay ran deepest, and the golden Detroit came in most vivid. Vera read these notes in the evenings and corrected 2 of them and confirmed the rest, and the notebook grew fat with 2 generations of handwriting. By the time Ruth was 30, she had inherited the notebook and the land and the method. She grew the beets through the 1990s and early 2000s as a supplement to the cash lease, and what began as a market table stall on Saturday mornings became, slowly, something more defined. A chef at a restaurant called Parkside Grill in Decatur called her in the autumn of 1998 and asked if she could supply the Chioggia on a weekly basis through the season. She said she could supply it from July through October. He said that was fine. The following year, a second restaurant in Decatur began buying the Golden Detroit, and a third reached out in 2002 asking about the cylindra, which they wanted for a roasted root dish they were adding to the menu. Ruth kept her acreage at 14. She did not hire anyone. She did not buy new equipment. She drove the Beets to town herself in the back of her truck each week and invoiced each restaurant by hand. By the standards the County Extension Service used to evaluate agricultural enterprise, this was not a livelihood. It was supplemental income from a small specialty crop on ground that the standard model said was difficult. Ruth did not dispute this. She simply kept planting. Let me tell you what happens to clay soil when you push a root into it without tilling, because this is the part that the standard model missed entirely. And it is the part that would matter enormously in the summer of 2012. The clay beneath the glacial ridge on Ruth's property was Montmorillonite clay, a mineral structure so fine-grained and so chemically active that it behaves almost like a sponge, expanding when wet, contracting when dry, holding water molecules in a mineral lattice rather than simply absorbing and releasing them the way sandy loam does. In a wet spring, Montmorillonite clay swells and feels almost greasy between your fingers, the plates of its mineral structure sliding against each other with the available water. In a dry summer, it contracts slowly, yielding moisture from its lattice over weeks rather than days, the way a dense sponge gives up water at a different rate than a loose one. A root crop planted in it and allowed to develop without disturbance sinks a taproot into that slow-release reservoir. The conventional wisdom said that clay compacted around roots and stunted them, and it was right about hybrid varieties bred for loose, tilled, commercial soil. Those varieties had shallow, branching root systems built for soil that had been prepared and loosened to receive them, and they could not push through clay's resistance with enough force to access the moisture below. The heritage varieties Vera had brought from Moravia had deeper, more linear root architecture, built across generations of selection in exactly this kind of ground that had never been amended for them because amendment had never been an option. The cylindra beet, in particular, drove a taproot 12 to 14 inches into undisturbed clay, reaching moisture that surface-dependent crops could not access once the topsoil dried. The plant had been bred over a century of European cultivation in clay-heavy soils to go down rather than across. There was one more thing the clay did, and this is the thing that Sandra Chu would later describe to her buyers in Chicago, who would describe it in turn to the chefs who would use these beets on their fall menus. It stressed the plants just enough, through that slow resistance, to concentrate their sugars and their pigments. A Chioggia beet grown in loose, irrigated, amended soil produces a clean, mild root with clear concentric rings and a Brix reading around 7. The same variety grown through Montmorillonite clay under dry summer conditions produces a root with a Brix reading 2 to 3 points higher, and with beta-chianin and beta-xanthin pigments, the red and yellow compounds that create the ring pattern, intensified by the mild stress into something vivid and chemically dense. The flavor is not just sweeter. It carries a mineral earthiness that comes, quite literally, from the mineral the plant has wrestled through for its entire growing season. Ruth knew this because Vera had written it in the notebook in 1974, in Czech, on the margin of the Chioggia variety page, and because Ruth had tasted the difference herself every year for 40 years. She had never tried to explain it with the words Brix or beta-chianin. She just knew it in the way you know a thing you have verified with your own hands across a lifetime, and never needed to argue about because the evidence arrived in October, every October, weighed by the pound and sold for its own sake. Dr. Philip Greer arrived in the spring of 2009. He was 44 years old, earnest and genuinely trying to help. He drove a white university pickup and carried a soil probe and a tablet loaded with Extension Service yield models, and he had spent 20 years helping Shelby County farmers solve soil problems. He was not a bad man. He believed in the science of the Extension Service bulletins, and those bulletins had been written by agronomists who worked with commercial hybrid varieties in trials designed around standard tillage and amendment regimes. Montmorillonite clay appeared in those bulletins precisely once in a table of problematic soil types. The recommended remediation was gypsum application to break calcium bonds, deep tillage to loosen structure, compost incorporation, and a follow-up of drip irrigation to manage the irregular moisture cycle. He pushed his probe into the clay, pulled a core, noted the color and the texture. He said, "You're fighting the soil, Ruth." He said it the way a doctor says a thing they have said before, and expect to have to say again. Nobody grows root crops in glacial clay without amendment. You'll get 40% of standard yield at best. That clay will stunt every taproot you plant. Ruth said it hasn't yet. He consulted his tablet. He showed her the yield projections. He showed her the cost-benefit on gypsum amendment versus expected return on heritage root crops at farmers' market pricing. The numbers were not in her favor by his model. She thanked him, walked him back to his truck, and went back to the field. Her border collie Rue had been working the outer rows while they talked, moving along the furrows with the particular economy of a dog that had been doing it for years. Rue was a blue merle with one white ear and a habit of sitting at the end of a completed row and waiting. She waited now at the end of the row nearest the truck, watching Dr. Greer's truck back down the gravel lane, and then she looked at Ruth. Ruth crouched and picked up a handful of clay. It was cold and dense and smelled of iron. She pressed her thumb into it and watched the impression hold perfectly, the way good clay holds a shape. She planted the Chioggia and the Cylindra and the Golden Detroit that same week. To the north of Ruth's property, Dale Henshaw ran 80 acres of mixed ground, 30 of it in the same glacial clay belt that cut across the eastern edge of the county. Dale was 51, a trim, careful man who kept a whiteboard in his barn with a running ledger of inputs and projected returns. He had farmed the same ground for 26 years, and he believed in the Extension Service the way a person believes in a system that has served them reliably. He had amended soils before on other parts of his acreage, and it had worked. The logic of the gypsum recommendation was sound to him, and the processing co-op contracts for commercial hybrid carrots offered a guaranteed floor price that a farmer's market stall could not promise. He took the recommendation. He hired a contractor to apply 12 tons of gypsum to his clay plot in late March, incorporated it with a subsoiler run at 14 inches, added 4 inches of compost from a supplier in Mattoon, and ran a drip line upgrade that cost him $34,000 in materials and labor. He bought new seed from a commercial variety catalog. Imperator hybrid carrots bred for uniform diameter and shelf life, and Atlantic white potatoes proven in the processing co-op system. He planted in April with a tractor-mounted precision seeder he had borrowed from a neighbor, the rows straight and perfectly spaced, the stand coming up fast in the loosened ground by early May. His operation was clean, managed, and legible to every spreadsheet that evaluated it. The county agent drove out in June and called it a model response to a soil challenge. Dale wrote that down on his whiteboard alongside the projected return. He was proud of that field. You could not fault him for it. At the farmer's market in Decatur that first summer, Ruth set out her Chioggia with a hand-lettered card that said only the variety name and the county. She sold out by 9 in the morning. A chef from a restaurant in Springfield stood at her table for 5 minutes, turned a beet in her hands, asked where they came from. Ruth told her about the clay. The chef bought everything Ruth brought the following 3 Saturdays. By August, 2 more restaurants had found her. The money was modest. Ruth sold at $3.50 per pound for the Chioggia and $4 for the Golden, and she moved perhaps 800 pounds through the season. It was enough to notice. It was not enough to change anyone's mind about the clay plots. At the Shelby County Agricultural Producers Meeting that October, Dr. Greer gave a presentation on soil management strategies for the following year. He had a slide deck projected on a pull-down screen at the front of the Shelby Electric Cooperative meeting room, and 30-some producers sat in folding chairs in the fluorescent light. Ruth was in the back row with her canvas hat in her lap. He mentioned the clay soil plots in the eastern part of the county as a teaching example. He said what some operations in the area were doing with unamended glacial clay was, at best, more hobby than farming. He said working against the science was understandable when the method had sentimental value, and he understood the appeal of the traditional varieties, but the yield data simply did not support it as a primary income strategy. He said it carefully and without condescension, the way an expert makes a gentle correction in a public setting, certain they are doing the person a service. Ruth sat in the back row and said nothing. A man 2 seats over looked at her briefly and then looked away. She drove home after the meeting and planted her garlic beds in the dark with a headlamp and went to bed. The following winter she heard through Dale that at a small producer's dinner in Findlay in December, Dr. Greer had described her operation to a table of neighboring farmers as a boutique hobby, maybe. Not a livelihood. He had said it in passing, as an aside to a larger point about scale and viability, and it had been repeated back to Ruth by Dale in the flat, slightly embarrassed tone of a man conveying something he didn't think needed to be said, but felt obligated to pass along. Ruth thanked him for telling her. She went home and checked the germination records in the notebook and began planning the spring's seed order. She had never asked anyone to believe in the clay. In the spring of 2012, Meg Holek drove home to Shelby County from Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, where she had spent 3 years completing a degree in crop and soil environmental science. She was 26, and she loved her mother with the particular, complicated love of a daughter who had watched her parent work alone and hard for most of her memory. And she had come home carrying the full weight of everything she had just been taught about soil physics and agronomy. She walked the clay plots on her second afternoon home. She crouched and pushed her hand into the ground the way her mother did, and she recognized the Montmorillonite immediately from her soil science coursework. She said carefully that she thought the Extension Service's recommendation about gypsum amendment wasn't unreasonable. Ruth was checking the germination on the Cylindra bed. She didn't look up. "The taproots are managing," she said. "The studies on heritage variety, root architecture in compacted clay are pretty limited," Meg said. She said it gently. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to tell her mother something she believed was useful. "Your grandmother knew that clay," Ruth said. Meg stood there a moment. Then she went inside and found Vera's notebook on the kitchen shelf and brought it to the porch and started reading. She read for 3 hours. She came back out to the field where Ruth was still working and said nothing. She just picked up a hoe and started thinning. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have named it as a beginning at the time. If you had walked the 2 properties that May, you would have seen what the model said you should see. Dale's amended ground was dark and loose, his hybrid carrots up in clean rows, the drip lines laid at precise intervals, everything modern and managed. His stand was even and fast, the kind of germination that made a new field look like a textbook photograph. Ruth's clay plots were slower to show, the seedlings smaller and more widely spaced, the ground between them hard and pale in the morning light, cracked at the surface in a shallow pattern that looked to a conventional eye like neglect or poverty. The visitors who sometimes walked the county road and peered at her field over the fence would not have bet on it. Rue moved along Ruth's rows each morning with the quiet authority of an animal that had been doing this for 8 years without needing it explained. She was 10 years old by 2012, gray coming in around her muzzle, but she worked the outer rows with the same economy she had always had, turning back at the end of each and sitting in the precise spot she had chosen that morning, with the attention of someone taking inventory. Ruth sometimes thought that Rue understood the rows better than she did, or at least attended to them with fewer distractions. The Springfield chef drove out in late May and walked the Chioggia beds with her boots in the clay, looking at the seedlings, asking about the spacing, and left with a crate of thinnings for her kitchen. She had been buying from Ruth for 2 years. She said nothing that day that she hadn't said before, but when she drove away, she was already planning her fall menu around what she expected those plants would become. If you stood at the fence between the 2 properties in June of 2012, the difference was visible, but not yet decisive. Dale's carrots were taller, their tops a confident green. Ruth's beets were shorter, more compact, the leaves a darker, tougher color. The clay between Ruth's rows had begun its summer contraction, cracking at the surface in the thin lines that always came before a dry stretch. Meg noted the cracking in a notebook she had started keeping and said nothing, because she did not yet know what she thought about it. Then came July. The summer of 2012 arrived on the Illinois prairie with a specific and documented violence. 47 consecutive days passed in Shelby County without measurable rain. Temperatures ran 12 degrees above the seasonal average for 6 weeks. The soil moisture index for the county dropped to the lowest recorded level since 1956. It was an agricultural crisis by any measure, and it behaved the way agricultural crises always behave, impersonally, without preference for the deserving or the undeserving, exposing whatever was fragile. Dale's amended ground was first. The gypsum and compost treatment had done exactly what the Extension Service said it would. It had opened the clay structure, improved drainage, and reduced compaction. In a normal year, that was unambiguously good. In the 47th day of drought, it meant that his drip irrigation was fighting to replace moisture that the now porous soil could not hold against the July heat. His drip line system, designed for supplemental irrigation in a normal moisture regime, ran at full capacity for 3 weeks. His water bill for August ran past $6,000. By the end of the month, 65% of his carrot crop showed heat stress, split taproots, forked growth, stunted shoulder development. What he had left he sold to a processing co-op at 18 cents a pound, a price that covered his input cost on those rows by roughly 40%. Ruth's clay held. Montmorillonite clay does not give up its water easily. While the amended ground on Dale's plot cracked open in the heat and released its moisture back to the atmosphere, the undisturbed clay on Ruth's 14 acres contracted slowly, shedding surface water, and then holding what remained in the mineral lattice 60 inches down. The Cylindra Beets taproots had been in that clay since April. They had grown down into it rather than across it, following the available moisture through the mineral lattice the way Vera's notebook had described, and by the time the surface of the field was pale and hard, those roots were still drawing from moisture that the heat could not reach. The surface of Ruth's clay plots looked, in late July of 2012, worse than it ever had. Cracked and pale and arid, without the reassuring green uniformity of irrigated ground. The beet tops were smaller than a commercial crop's tops would have been. To a passing eye, they still looked like trouble. Ruth ran no irrigation at all through 6 weeks of drought. She walked the rows each morning with Rue and did not see what she needed to worry about. The beets were slow and compact and concentrated, doing what heritage varieties do in a dry year in ground that can't be easily abandoned. She lost not 1 acre. Meg walked the property line on a Thursday morning in late July, looking from her mother's green tops to Dale's stressed rows 50 yards away. She had her soil physics textbook somewhere in her car. She didn't go get it. She stood at the fence for a long time. The bricks on the Chioggia is going to be high this year, Ruth said from behind her. Because of the stress, Meg said. It wasn't a question. Your grandmother wrote it in 1974. Meg turned around and looked at her mother. She said, "Can I read the whole notebook?" That was the other beginning, or the same one, further along. On the first Saturday in September, Ruth drove to the farmer's market in Decatur with 400 pounds of Chioggia beets, 200 pounds of the Golden Detroit, and a flat of the Cylindra she had been saving back for the right buyer. She set up in her usual spot, spread canvas over the table, laid the beets out in rows. At 8:30, a woman in her mid-40s approached the table. She was not from Shelby County. She carried a small canvas tote with the name of a Chicago produce buyers cooperative on the side, and she moved through the market the way someone moves when they are not shopping, but evaluating. Her name was Sandra Chu, and she had driven from Chicago the previous evening to spend the morning in Decatur, following a note from the Springfield chef who had been buying from Ruth for 2 years, and had mentioned the beets in a conversation about regional sourcing. Sandra worked for a produce buyers cooperative that had contracts with 17 Whole Food stores across the Midwest region, and she had been looking for a reliable heritage beet source for 2 seasons. She had visited 4 other farms in that time. None of them had produced what her buyers were asking for. Sandra stood at Ruth's table for a while without picking anything up. She looked at the layout, at the hand-lettered card, at the varieties arranged without flourish or decoration on plain canvas. She was not impressed by presentation. She was looking at the beets themselves, at the color depth of the Chioggia, and the even, unblemished skin of the golden Detroit. Finally, she lifted a Chioggia, set it back down, picked up a second one, held it at different angles in the morning light. She pulled a small knife from her tote, the kind a chef carries, and cut the beet cleanly in half. The cross-section opened up in concentric rings, deep red at the outer edge, white at the center. Another ring of red, another of white, all the way to the heart of it. The rings so precise and vivid, they looked like something drawn. She held the two halves to the light. She turned one over. She bent slightly and smelled the cut face of it. She tasted it. She stood upright and set the knife down on the canvas. The market moved around them. A woman 2 tables over called out prices on squash. Someone's cartwheel squeaked across the pavement. Sandra Chu looked at the Chioggia in her hand and said nothing for a long moment. "Where are these from?" she said. "Shelby County," Ruth said. "What soil?" "Glacial clay, Montmorillonite, 14 acres of it on the East Ridge." Sandra looked at her steadily. "Unamended?" "Unamended?" Another pause. "What's your yield per acre?" Ruth told her the number. Sandra set the beet down carefully, as if placing it somewhere it belonged. It was the kind of quiet that, in a buying conversation, meant a calculation was being run, a model being checked against a reality that had just arrived and did not fit the column it was being compared against. She said, "I'd like to talk about a contract." 3 weeks later, the written offer arrived at the farmhouse on County Road, 1000 East. Ruth read it at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp, Rue at her feet, Meg sitting across from her. The first-year contract value was $186,000 with a 5-year renewal option and a per-pound premium 12% above current regional market pricing for specialty root vegetables. The county average for a comparable root crop operation of similar scale in Shelby County that year, as Ruth knew from the Farm Bureau report, was $23,000. She read the number. She set the paper on the table. Nobody in that kitchen said anything for a long time. Meg was the one who finally spoke. She said, "Grandma Vera's notebook has 14 varieties listed. You're only growing 6. Ruth looked at her. She said, "I know." That number, $186,000, landed in Shelby County the way a plumb line lands. Quiet, precise, and settling things. The Farm Bureau report had already noted that season's losses in the clay belt among operations that had followed the amendment recommendation. 7 farms in the eastern part of the county had lost between 40 and 70% of their root crop yields to the drought. 3 had taken on emergency operating loans. The County Extension Service was preparing a soil resilience report for the following year's planning cycle. And somewhere in that report, the data from Ruth's 14 acres needed to be accounted for. Dr. Philip Greer heard the contract number from 2 people before he heard it from Ruth, and he drove out to the property on a Wednesday in late October. The beets had already been pulled and stored for the contract delivery, and the clay plots showed the pale, cracked surface they always showed after harvest, bare and gray in the October light. He walked the rows with his clipboard, Rue moving along behind him at a polite distance, with her usual assessment of strangers. He was dressed for a field visit, not the office, and his boots had already picked up clay at the edges by the second row. He had a number of questions, most of which he asked the ground rather than Ruth. At the end of a row, he set his clipboard down and pushed the toe of his boot into the clay and watched the impression hold. Then he looked at Ruth and said, "What was your bricks on the Chioggia this year?" 9.8, Ruth said. He stood there a moment. The number meant something specific to him. A commercial Chioggia in a normal year runs around 7. He said nothing for long enough that Rue came over and sat down next to him. He was not a man who found the next thing easy to say, and he did not pretend otherwise. He said, "I'd like to see your mother's notebook, if that's all right." She brought it out to the porch and handed it to him. He sat in the porch chair and read it straight through, turning the pages carefully, moving between the check annotations and Ruth's English notes in the back. He read for 40 minutes. Rue sat on the step beside Ruth's feet and watched him the way she watched the rose, patiently, without expectation. When he was done, he closed the notebook and held it out to Ruth and said, "I've been recommending gypsum amendment on this clay belt for 15 years. 7 operations followed that recommendation this year. I've been going through the loss reports this week." He paused. The yield model didn't account for the heritage root architecture. The variety specifics weren't in the trial data I was working from. Ruth took the notebook. She said, "Most people didn't know him." He nodded. He picked up his clipboard. He said, without looking at her, "I'd like to put together a site visit for our Soil Health Committee in the spring, if you'd be willing. I think there's something we got wrong about that bulletin." She said she'd consider it. That winter, 3 of Ruth's neighbors came to her individually and asked about the clay plots. Dale Henshaw came in January, after he'd run his final numbers for the year, and sat with them for a while at his whiteboard and erased what was there. He stood in Ruth's kitchen and drank coffee and said, without embellishment, that he'd like to try the 1 plot of the Cylindra in the spring, if she'd sell him some seed stock. He said he understood if she'd rather not. He said it the way a person says a thing they expect to be told no. Ruth told him she would. She sold seed that winter to 4 neighboring operations at cost and wrote out the planting method from Vera's notebook in her own hand for each of them. The dibber spacing, the surface compost line, the aggressive thinning to 8 inches, the instruction not to break the clay below the seed hole. She did not expand her own operation. She stayed at 22 acres. She had been asked twice that winter about scaling, once by a distributor's representative who had seen the Whole Foods contract, and once by an investor who had heard the number from someone at a regional food conference, and both times she had said no. The clay plots on the East Ridge produced what they produced. You could not move them. You could not replicate them somewhere else and get the same beet. The soil was the answer. You didn't export it. She paid off the remaining $8,000 of mortgage on the property in March 2013. She told Meg over the kitchen table. She set the paid-off note on the table between them, and they sat with it for a minute, and then Ruth got up and made coffee. That was the extent of the celebration. If you want to understand what the right sizing of a thing looks like, that was it. Not the number, not the contract. The paid note on the kitchen table, the 2 cups of coffee, the field still waiting on the other side of the window. In the spring of 2013, Meg planted her own section of the clay, a half-acre on the southern edge of the ridge that Ruth had left fallow for 2 seasons. She worked it herself with a dibber and her hands, setting the Chioggia seed in at 8-inch spacings the way Vera's notebook specified, laying the surface compost line, moving down each row on her knees in the cold April ground. She had spent the winter photographing every page of Vera's notebook, all 118 pages of it, and entering the variety notes into a preservation database she had built with 2 of her contacts at Purdue's Plant Sciences program, a graduate student and an associate professor who studied open-pollinated vegetable genetics. The university agreed to host the database. Meg wrote the variety descriptions herself, drawing on both Vera's check annotations and Ruth's English notes, cross-referencing them with what historical records she could find about beet cultivation in Moravia in the early 20th century. All 14 varieties that Vera had brought from Moravia in 1971 were cataloged, described, and represented in seed by the spring of 2014. The seed was stored in 3 locations. The farmhouse on County Road 1000 East held the primary stock. A university seed bank in West Lafayette held the second. A regional heritage seed cooperative in Iowa held the third. Vera's notebook was photographed at 600 dpi and archived in 2 formats. It still sat on the kitchen shelf, the original, between a coffee mug and a jar of the previous fall's saved cylindra seed. Meg had not planned to stay in Shelby County. She had taken the Purdue degree with the intention of a career in soil science or environmental consulting, and there was no shortage of programs that would have hired her. But she had crouched at a fence line in late July of 2012 and watched what the drought did to 2 pieces of adjacent ground managed by 2 different philosophies, and the soil physics textbook in her car had not had anything useful to add to what she saw. Some things you understand through calculation, and some things you understand through your knees in April clay. By the end of 2013, 4 neighboring farms in the clay belt had planted heritage root varieties using the Holek method. The County Extension Service produced a bulletin on heritage beet cultivation in Montmorillonite soils, reviewed by Dr. Greer and citing several of the variety notes from Vera's original notebook, which Ruth had allowed to be photographed for the document. She did not ask for attribution. She did not attend the meeting where the bulletin was presented. She was in the field. There is a thing that a credentialed system does with what it cannot measure. It classifies it. It puts it in a column labeled inefficient, or hobby, or sentimental, or folk practice, and it proceeds from there, certain that the column is complete. Dr. Greer was a careful man and an honest one, and his column was not wrong by the logic of the model he was working from. The model had been built on hybrid varieties in standard conditions, and it had never asked what happened to the older kinds in the ground they had been selected for across a century of selection pressure. The model measured what was easy to count. It did not count the mineral memory of the clay, the slow release of stored moisture 60 inches down, the way a taproot that could push through resistance concentrated everything it encountered into a density of flavor that a buying agent from Chicago would stop in the middle of a market to hold up to the light. What a system values and what is truly valuable are, sometimes, 2 different inventories. The first inventory is legible, printable, distributable as a slide deck. The second inventory is written in a canvas notebook in 2 languages by a woman who grew up on clay in Moravia and came to Illinois with seeds in a cloth bag and a practical understanding of what ground could do that she never felt she needed to argue about. The first inventory corrects you, the second feeds you, and in a drought year, the second is the only one that matters. Ruth Holek had known this not as a philosophy, but as a working principle for 40 years, because her mother had written it into the margins of that notebook, and because the clay had confirmed it every season since 1971. The heritage varieties held through the drought because they had always held through drought in the soils they were made for, long before anyone came with a tablet and a yield model to tell them they shouldn't. Attention to a specific piece of ground over a long time produces a knowledge that cannot be extracted from it and placed elsewhere. It stays in the ground, in the seed, in the hands that learn to read both. On a Saturday morning in early April of 2014, Ruth stood at the edge of the East Ridge field. The clay was cold and damp from the spring thaw, pale gray in the morning light. Meg was behind her with Vera's notebook open, reading out the planting spacings for the cylindra. 4 neighbors would plant the Holek method that season. The Whole Foods contract had renewed for its 2nd year. The canvas notebook had been photographed, cataloged, and preserved in 3 places. Rue sat at Ruth's feet, watching the field the way she always had, with the patient attention of an animal that had been doing this work for a long time and saw no reason to stop. Ruth crouched and pressed her thumb into the clay. The impression held, clean and precise, the way good clay has always held shape. She planted the first seed of the season. What is rigid breaks. What belongs to the ground it came from endures,